You never expect betrayal to come wrapped in gentle hands. When I got sick last year, I thought I was losing my body, not my marriage. Harold and I had been together 41 years. We'd built a quiet life in North Carolina, with morning coffee on the porch and old Motown on the radio. He used to say we'd grow old side by side, bro, and I believed him. But illness has a way of showing you who's really standing beside you, and who's just standing nearby. When the young caregiver, Melissa, started coming around, I saw kindness at first, the kind you pay for, the kind that makes you feel seen. I didn't see the rest of it until it was too late. This isn't a story about a woman losing everything. It's about what happens after, when she decides to take her life, her strength, and her dignity back. When Harold and I first talked about getting older, it was over coffee on the little porch we'd built together the summer before he retired. He had that easy grin, the one that made me forgive his crooked garden rose. And he said, "We'll grow old side by side, Ellie. No surprises." I believed him the way you believe the weather report when it says sunny and the sun is already on your face. For 41 years, that kind of trust felt ordinary between us, the sort that's built on small, steady things. The way he would warm my tea without being asked, the way I'd fold his shirts on Sundays, the quiet habit of sharing the last slice of pie. Then the arthritis began to make itself known in new ways. First, it was just my fingers, a stiffness that came with the mornings. Then the fatigue that used to be a cloud that lifted by noon started to sit with me like a heavy blanket. I would stand at the sink and the dishes would swim, and there were afternoons when my legs felt like someone else's. Harold fussed and fretted, the worry making him shorter somehow, and I hated that. I didn't want him to shrink around me. We asked the doctor for time and exercises, and a promise that pain could be managed, and for a while that worked. We adapted. We changed routines. We learned the new rhythms of a life with limits. When Harold suggested hiring someone to help with a few hours during the day, I was surprised by how relieved I felt. It wasn't that I wanted to be left alone, quite the opposite. I was weary of being an island for him to worry about, tired of seeing the guilt behind his eyes when he forgot to take a breath. We interviewed Melissa the way you interview a new neighbor, careful and a little hopeful. She was younger than us by a good 20 years, with quick hands and a soft voice. She listened like she meant it, and took notes on her phone with that professional air. Harold liked that. I liked that too, because part of me still wanted to be useful in the world, not only in our little house. The first weeks were gentle. Melissa arrived at 9 and left at 4, and in between she made lunches that smelled like garlic and lemon, and put things away in the places Harold and I could not seem to remember ourselves. She folded blankets without fussing, put a tray of tea on the ottoman when I wanted it, and washed a pan without making a production of it. Small mercies. Harold seemed lighter, his shoulders less hunched. He laughed with me at the television during evening news segments, and he went to bed earlier, his hand finding mine in the dark the way it always had. For the first time in months, I slept through the night more than I woke. There are kindnesses that come with payment, and kindnesses that come from habit. At first, Melissa's were the kind you pay for, efficient, professional, tidy. Then they bent into something softer. She started to tell me about her niece's piano recitals. She asked Harold about the tools he kept in his shed. She remembered my favorite armchair, and would tuck a throw pillow behind my back without being asked. I told myself that was part of the job description. Attention, companionable chatter, small attentions. It felt for a while like the house had room again. The new routine settled in like a warm blanket. We had quiet afternoons with crossword puzzles and short walks to the mailbox, Harold carrying my light shopping bags as if it were the only important work left of his day. On Mondays, Melissa taught me little stretches to keep my fingers moving, and on Wednesdays we'd rearrange the bookshelf like two women curating a tiny museum. She had a way of making ordinary things seem tidy and manageable. Harold admired that in her in the way you admire a good tool. Practical, useful, appreciated. I found myself admiring it too. but small things have a way of whispering truths if you listen for them. It started with the laughter, soft, edged with something private, coming from the kitchen when I was in my chair. I would look up from the book I pretended to read and catch a glance between them. Two people mid-conversation, smiling in a way that felt different from the shared jokes Harold and I had carried for years. I told myself I was being silly. I told myself that after decades together, Harold deserved the lightness of new friendship. He had always liked people who could brighten a room. Then there were the errands that lasted longer than necessary. Harold began to say he had to run a quick errand and come back with a bag of flowers or a small pastry, looking as if he had been thinking of me the whole time. I liked the flowers. I liked the pastries, but the pattern made a small fissure in the day, and fissures widen if you ignore them for long. Once I caught Harold's sleeve looped around Melissa's arm as they came back from the market. A casual touch, a friendly guide, nothing declared. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the arthritis. I tried to name the feeling. Was it jealousy? Was it the sting of watching my place at the center of Harold's days being rearranged? Or was it the more complex grief at recognizing that ailments make you vulnerable in ways you hadn't anticipated? Not only physically, but socially. When you become a patient in your own life, the dynamics shift. People step in. People take over. You are grateful, but sometimes that gratitude has the texture of fear. One afternoon I asked Melissa to sit and tell me about herself. You don't have to answer if it's too personal, I said, because that was the way I had taught my students to be, kind, but with boundaries. She smiled in that quick, bright way and told me she was studying nursing at night and helping her mother during the day, saving for a small apartment. She spoke of hopes in a voice that was tired and practical. Harold listened, leaning in, and I felt something warm that was not the same as closeness with me. It was a different kind of interest. Younger, urgent, curious. It felt like watching rain fall in a place you used to stand. I didn't confront them. There was no scene, no raised voice, no dramatic moment. Just a tightening inside me, like the first stitch pulled too tight. Maybe there should have been fireworks. Perhaps that is what people imagine when they think of betrayal. But real life is often quieter. It is the small decisions that rearrange the long table. A step taken here, a laugh shared there, a missed question asked in the evening. Harold's answers when I asked simple things about the day were short, distracted. "You're imagining things," he said once, and it felt like a dismissal and an instruction in one phrase. Sometimes dismissals are easier to accept than questions. When someone you love tells you you are imagining something, you want to believe them because the alternative is to sit with unease and try to sew it back together. Yet the unease kept returning. I found myself watching their faces when they thought I wasn't looking. I took note of the times Harold said, "I'll be back soon," and stayed gone longer than he said. I watched Melissa's phone light up on the counter and watched Harold's hand hover before he picked it up. I learned how to count minutes in ways I never had to. It would be unfair to put all the blame on either of them in that moment of noticing. Illness does strange things to relationships. Where once there were two people tending a life, suddenly one person bears a different weight, and both adapt. Harold had been worn thin by worry and work and the responsibility of caring, and Melissa was the answer he'd reached for in his fatigue. I felt compassion for him, even as my heart scraped at the edges. But compassion does not mean erasing the sense of being replaced. In the quiet of the evenings when the house settled, when the television murmured and the kettle cooled, I sat with my own thoughts. I let the ache be honest. I wrote in a small notebook I'd kept since college, the pen moving slowly because of my stiff fingers. I wrote about the way the light fell across the table, how the roses in the vase were a pale, stubborn pink, how being cared for felt like both a balm and a challenge. Writing made things visible. It gave the unease a name and, in naming it, a shape I could examine. On a morning when rain smudged the glass and everything smelled like wet earth, I decided to make breakfast for myself. It felt like an act of small rebellion, not against Harold, not against Melissa, but against the part of me that had been shrinking. I boiled an egg buttered toast and put out the good china. Harold came in, saw the spread, and hesitated in the doorway. He picked up his cup and kissed my forehead. For a moment, there was the man I married, familiar, a little surprised and tender. I let that moment sit in me like a warm stone. And yet, even as I fed myself, the quiet shifts continued to whisper. The tender routine had become a different kind of rhythm, one that included a new voice and a new presence. I promised myself to watch, to learn, to hold steady. Illness had demanded patience of me, but patience is not the same as blind acceptance. If the life I built with Harold was changing, I wanted to understand it before it left me behind. So I made my tea, folded the napkins, and kept my notebook close, prepared not for fireworks but for whatever small, honest conversations might come next. When silence moves into a house, it doesn't arrive like a shout. It slips in like dusk through the curtains, unnoticed at first, then unmistakable. That was what happened between Harold and me. At the beginning it was small things. An empty chair at the end of the table, the clink of a spoon in a room I had already left, Harold's voice trailing down the hallway when I expected it beside me. I thought about weather and medicine and tiredness, about how illness rearranges days. But the silences kept coming and they began to gather weight. Dinner used to be the thing that marked the day for us. Not elaborate, nothing like the dinner parties I used to plan in my teaching days, but steady. One light on in the kitchen, the radio playing something old, Harold carving a little corner of the roast for me because he knew how I liked the meat. After Melissa started, the table stayed set more often than not. He'd lift his head and say, "I ate already," or "I had a bite at the shop." It was never said with anger. It was said like an explanation about the weather. He brought the meals to the table less and less. Sometimes I would find a plate in the sink, a knife with crumbs. Once I left my chair to fetch a tray and came back to find his coat missing from the peg and the porch light on. He'd smile when he came in later, apologetic and quick. But the apology felt like a bandage over something that needed stitches. You learn the small rhythms of someone you've lived with for 40 years. You can tell when they are distracted not by what they say, but by how they put a coffee cup down. Harold started leaving his cup without wiping it. He forgot small tasks. He would tell a story we'd told 100 times and end before the punchline, as if he'd misplaced his place. I worried. I worried about him the way you worry about a child who has mislaid their shoes. I wanted to ask if he was tired. I wanted to say, "Tell me if this is too much for you," and mean it with the softness it deserved. Instead, I watched. Melissa's shifts lengthened so gently it could have been coincidence. One week she stayed an hour later on Tuesday. The next week she stayed an hour later on Tuesday and Thursday. She would tell me she had to pick up something for her mother, that her night classes ran late, that she was meeting a friend. I believed her the first few times. I liked that she had a life beyond our walls. It made me feel like I was part of a larger world again. But then the small incongruities started. The laundry that had been done didn't match the routine she'd introduced. Harold coming in smelling faintly of her shampoo some evenings. I told myself to pay attention without naming it in the house, because when you name a worry out loud, it can demand an answer you might not be ready to give. The first time I tried to talk to Harold about it, I made tea and set 2 cups on the table. He took his, sat down, and I said, "Do you feel different lately?" I felt foolish asking, but it was honest. He looked at me with that patient look he uses when I'm trying a new recipe and can't quite get the measurements right. "Different how?" he asked. I reminded myself of the early days, of how we had learned each other, the long, patient work of marriage that doesn't show on postcards. I said, "You're not home the way you used to be." He sipped his tea and then said, softly, "You're imagining things. Ellie, you really are." The words landed like wet leaves on water. They didn't splash, they only sank. The phrase was both a balm and a slight. It calmed me because who wants to live with a partner who believes you are seeing ghosts? But it was also a dismissal, as if my perception were faulty. You learn as you age that "you're imagining it" is a potent phrase. It can make you check yourself like a mirror. It can make you doubt the truth that is sitting quietly beside you. I walked away from that conversation feeling more tired than my arthritis would justify. I told myself to be grateful for the help in the house, for the steam-ironed shirts, for the clean linens. Gratitude is a practical thing. It steadies you. But gratitude can also smooth corners where edges should remain sharp. I began to keep a small list in my head. Times Harold said he would be back and wasn't. The nights the porch light was on and he was late. The laugh I half heard through the door that used to only belong to me. I did not want to be the person who kept tally of small hurts. It's a heavy thing to carry. But I started to notice the pattern like a seamstress notices a pulled thread. My daughter called more often. She lives 2 hours away and has her own life full of children and schedules and a steady job. "Mom, come stay with me for a few days," she said one afternoon, her voice small with concern. I considered it. I thought about packing a bag, about the relief of another kitchen and another bed, but there was something about leaving that felt like running. I have always been the kind who sits with a problem until it softens or until I can name it. So I stayed. I didn't tell my daughter everything. I said I was tired and that Harold and I were adjusting. She sent me recipes and a list of funny podcasts and told me to call if I needed a ride to an appointment. Her concern was a gentle current at the edge of my days. There were evenings when Harold and I sat with the TV on, and he would reach out and take my hand. Those were not all gone. I am not telling you that our marriage was some tale washed of tenderness. There were moments still. A dish placed where it used to be. A sweater folded with the exact fold he had perfected over the years. He would bring his hand to my cheek in the quiet, like he was checking the map of me. Those small returning kindnesses made me cling to hope like driftwood. Hope, after all, is practical. It helps people stand longer. But the quiet distance has a way of recalibrating what you expect. Conversations that once flowed like a slow river became more like stepping stones. You had to plan your path. When I asked Harold about Melissa's schedule, about why she seemed to be here so much, he laughed in that particular way he has when he wants to close a subject. "She helps," he said. "You know how much that relieves me." It was true. It did relieve him. There was a relief on his face that used to belong to the way the garden looked after a storm. I appreciated that relief. I wanted him to be less worn, but I also wanted part of the relief to come from me, from the work we had done together over decades. The balancing of that, wanting him to be lighter, wanting him to keep me in his light, is a complicated thing. It doesn't look pretty when you try to explain it. Sometimes the doubt eats quietly at the edges of the day. I would sit in the armchair and watch them talk and laugh about a memory I was not in. I would notice how Melissa leaned in when Harold spoke, the tilt of her head. I told myself that people of different ages form friendships. Perhaps that is the truth. Perhaps that is also what was happening. The trouble was that I didn't feel part of that new conversation. I felt like a room being rearranged without being asked. If I am honest, there were nights when I lay awake and went over every possibility like someone tracing the outline of a map. Perhaps Harold had met someone he found comforting in ways he felt he could not be for me. Perhaps Melissa was lonely, and Harold's attention was only a bridge. Perhaps none of it was terrible, but the not knowing is a heavy thing too. It presses on you like the humid air before a storm. I began to pay attention to the small practical things as if they were evidence in a case. Where was the mail addressed to? Who answered which calls? Did the bank statements show anything odd? These are not dramatic investigations. They are how ordinary people check if their lives are the same as they remember them. I walked the house like someone checking the perimeter. Not intrusive, simply aware. I dusted the shelf in a different way. Rearranged a stack of magazines I had grown tired of, just to see if the house would answer back. Sometimes it did. Harold would come in and sit, and we would talk about the neighbor's new dog or about the repairs on the roof. Those conversations were ordinary and grounding. Other times the house remained a quiet witness to a shifting pattern I might not have been able to name. I talked to friends at the church, the women I've known since our children were small. They listened, as friends do, some with practical advice, and others with the kind of stories that comfort, because they tell you you are not alone. "It's not always what it seems," one of them said, deft and kind. "Sometimes people take time and then they come back." Another said quietly, "Keep your heart in your head. Don't let the fear of losing him make you lose yourself." I like that more than anything. Keep your heart in your head. I made tea and sat with that phrase the way you sit with a good book. It felt like a small instruction manual for an uncertain season, so I began to collect myself in small ways. I measured my own days by things that belonged to me alone. The pages of a book I could finish in an afternoon, the walks around the block I could manage without worry, the recipes I would try when I felt like being bold. I wrote in my notebook, not only the small lists of occurrences, but a few sentences about how the light looked that day and what I felt in my bones. Writing steadied me. It is a simple device, but it helps you talk to yourself honestly without the clutter of a too-quick heart. I wanted to know what I thought before I spoke it aloud, and I knew the next truth even as I tried to slow my breathing. You cannot live forever in the tentative space between questions and answers. Either the silence would be explained, or it would reveal itself as something else. Either Harold would step back across the table and pull me into his day again, or the pattern would continue until it was not a pattern, but a new life I would have to reckon with. There is a difference between patience and passivity. I told myself I would choose the first. I would wait, and I would watch. But I would not be merely passive. I would keep noticing, keep writing, keep the small routines that said softly, "I am still here." So the quiet widened. I learned to sip my tea without expecting someone to ask for the last piece of toast. I learned to fold laundry in the late afternoon light and to leave the porch light on when Harold did not come back on time. I learned to meet my own eyes in the mirror and ask, without blame, what I needed. The distance felt like a problem that could either be solved by conversation or by the slow action of living differently. I was not yet ready to choose a path. I was still collecting the facts, still feeling the ache, still believing stubbornly that we had built a life with many doors, that perhaps one, quiet and ordinary, would open again. I woke to rain before the alarm, the kind of steady, soft rain that makes the world hush, like someone had turned down the volume on everything outside. For a moment I lay very still and listened to the house breathe, the radiator ticking, the gutters whispering, and felt a small, grateful pulse for the ordinary sounds. Then I heard another sound. Voices, too close and too bright for the hour, coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was the radio. Harold used to put the news on early when he was fixing something in the garage, but this was different. It had the warmth of conversation and a softness I hadn't heard between them before. I sat up, sleeves of my pajamas catching on the quilt, and padded across the hall without thinking. The hallway smelled like the lemon cleaner Melissa used. Someone had left the window slightly ajar to let the damp air in. They were there, Harold and Melissa, voices low and laughing, like two people sharing a quiet joke at the back of a theater so they won't be shushed. I stopped by the doorway because I didn't want to be dramatic. I'm not one for scenes, not in my house, not after decades of preferring to take the long route to a problem. But when Melissa said it, a pocket of the room folded shut. "Sweetheart," she said, the words soft, inked for him only, and the way she said it made the words look new, as if they'd been wrapped in tissue. My chest hollowed in a way I hadn't felt since my knees gave out on me in that garden bed last spring. They weren't loud. They weren't secretive like teenagers. They were casual, intimate in the way of people who have started to make the same coffee together each morning. Harold's laugh had the small tremor I've come to recognize when he's embarrassed. Not with me. Not for me. And he said something about a plan. Something about moving with a timing that sounded like a promise to himself, more than a question to anyone else. I stood there, fingers pressed to the doorframe, and watched them tilt toward each other as two neighbors might lean to better hear the same story. The scene was ordinary and somehow catastrophic. When my mind tried to tally what to do, it went through the motions that have felt sensible since my teaching days. Breathe, observe, gather. I retreated to the kitchen like someone stepping back to see a map. The counter was scattered with the small, familiar mess of their mornings. A mug with a crescent of lipstick, a folded grocery list, Melissa's phone face down near the fruit bowl. I told myself not to touch anything, to be patient, to let the moment present itself without the urgency of accusation. But my fingers reached for the phone as if on their own, pressing the power button to see if it would give me anything I could hold. There was a text on the screen, not meant to be read by me, Or perhaps it was meant for him, the message sitting like a small, bright stone on the display. Can't wait to start our new life together. I'll call you tonight about the move. XO. The sender's name was familiar in the way names become familiar in small towns. It was not my name. My mouth went dry. I remember feeling the room tilt, like the house had taken one of those gentle, exasperating breaths we used to laugh at in hurricanes. I put the phone back down as if the screen might burn. I didn't storm in. I did not throw the kettle or knock over a chair. My training, the slow, patient, relentless pedagogy of 40 years in a classroom, kept my hands steady. I made tea. I put 2 cups on the table as if we had no fractures in the porcelain of our days. Harold came into the kitchen like it was any other morning, shirt untucked, hair mussed in the way he sometimes does when he's been reading. He kissed my forehead, the same small ritual he has performed for decades, and for a second I almost believed in the old map again. He didn't see my face change. He didn't see how the teacup needed both hands to feel warm. I decided not to confront him with the phone because I couldn't make my voice not tremble then. I have always believed that accusations deserve the dignity of a clear question, not an outburst. So I asked quietly, as if we were rehearsing a script for civility, "What did you mean about moving?" He blinked, the slow blink of someone waking from a dream, and said, "What are you talking about?" In the way spouses ask one another about the weather. I put the phone on the table between us and let it be a third presence at the breakfast. He looked at the screen, and the color went out of his face like someone had pulled a curtain. He tried first to laugh it away. "Oh, that's Melissa being silly," he said. "She likes to text like that." That phrase, "she likes to text," was a squeezing cloth around my chest. I asked again, firmer this time, "Is that what I think?" He looked away. I could see his jaw work behind his beard as if chewing on an explanation. He said it differently then, the way you say something you want to be true. "She's leaving soon, Ellie. She wants to be closer to her work. She's thinking of moving in with a friend. I was just helping her with plans." The words were small, and as they landed, I felt them erode something inside me. It wasn't one singular sentence that broke me. It was the accumulation of all the small acceptances, the way he had been folding himself into someone else's life while keeping me in the corner of the room like a beloved but out-of-date photograph. I remember sitting down slowly, the chair making a tiny sound against the floor, and realizing I had been living with a man who was making room in his days for someone else. Not in a practical way, not because we needed the help, in a way that rearranged the map of us. For a few hours after that, I moved as if underwater. I went about the motions that demand no thought, folded laundry, watered the plants, checked the mail. My hands did the tactile work of living when my head was busy with hypotheses. You go through the mental inventory when a truth lands you. The times he had been late without explanation, the evenings he had seemed absent, the music he had started humming that wasn't in our record collection. It is a cruel exercise to undo a life by looking for the seams, but you do it because the mind wants to stitch what it can before the fabric unravels. When Harold finally left the kitchen, probably to make up a reason to be gone, I walked the house by myself. Each room held an echo of earlier tenderness. The desk where Harold kept his tools, the armchair where he'd snore quietly after the evening news, the little porcelain dog on the mantel I'd scavenged at a church fair years ago. They felt like witnesses, and I wanted them to tell me that the world had not changed. But the world is a stubborn thing. It moves on its own axis regardless of what you pray it will do. The house hummed, indifferent to my need for affirmation. I didn't call my daughter that morning because calls at that hour would have been an intrusion into her life. She had her own routines and children to shepherd. Instead, I wrote down the facts as if I were a teacher preparing a report. Date, weather, observed behaviors. I wrote to make things orderly because chaos feels worse when it's unnamed. Later, when the rain stopped and the house took a breath, Harold came back with the grocery bag and that apologetic look that used to soften my anger. "I'm sorry, love," he said. "We'll talk tonight, I promise." His voice was the voice of someone practiced in softening, and for a moment I wanted to believe him. I wanted to slide back into the warm cocoon of repetition, but something had shifted in me. The knowledge of the message, the shape of the word sweetheart, had altered the landscape. That night, when we lay in bed and the sheet slipped cool around my knees, Harold slept toward the wall. His spine curved away from mine the way it does when a person makes a decision they have not yet announced. I watched the ceiling and tried to count backward like I used to before exams, but the numbers turned into memories instead. The way he had looked at me on our wedding day, the time he carried me across the porch threshold when the movers were late, the way we had learned to share a breath in the small hours. It hurt in a place that was not just the chest or the head, but a kind of trunk of years. I thought about calling him out then, about producing the evidence and asking for explanations. Instead, I listened to him breathe and let the sound make the room ordinary again. Grief is not always explosive. Sometimes it is a long, patient staying awake beside oneself. I lay there and let the facts arrange themselves into a quiet plan. I would wait to see what he did. I would not be hasty. I would hold my dignity like a coat over my shoulders. It felt like the first adult decision I had made in a long time that belonged wholly to me. Outside, the rain softened and the night sounded like a folded sheet. My mind circled the promise Harold had once made. Grow old, side by side. And I marveled at how quickly words can be rearranged by living. The man I loved, who had warmed my tea and held my hand through illnesses, seemed to be stepping into a life that looked different from ours. I didn't know then if he would return or if the map would be rewritten altogether. All I knew was that the house would hold both the memory and the new fact, that love could be both a shelter and a place to be left, and that I would have to learn how to live in the presence of that knowledge. The rain that morning had a steady, small insistence, the kind that makes the house breathe softer and the world feel wrapped in wool. I woke before my alarm, not because of pain or need, but because the house was just the right kind of quiet to hear things you normally would not. There was a kettle of sound in the walls, the pipes, the rain on the porch, and beneath that, a softer sound. Voices. Two voices, low and close, moving through the kitchen like two birds in conversation. At first I thought it was the late morning show playing, or maybe Harold on the phone, but there was a rhythm to the words that made me sit up. I propped myself on my elbow and listened. Harold's voice was familiar, the low, steady tone that had read bedtime stories and mumbled through his crossword for 41 years. Melissa's was light and quick like a spring breeze. The sound of them together should have been ordinary. The caretaker and the patient. Two people sharing small arrangements about meals or bills. But the way they laughed, the way they reached the end of a sentence and didn't look for me to be part of it, felt foreign in my own home. I moved toward the doorway without thinking, because old habits are the ones that move for you when you don't have the energy to make them. The kitchen was dim, a soft gray from the rain-filtered light, and there they were by the sink, hands busy, shoulders angled toward one another. Harold was telling a story, something about a nephew's little league game, and Melissa was listening with the kind of attention that falls somewhere between admiration and interest. She touched his arm as she laughed. It was a small, ordinary touch, nothing dramatic, and yet it landed in me like a bell clapper. Then I heard it. She said without any pretense of hiding it, "Sweetheart." The word itself is not unusual in other people's mouths. I had called Harold that in the beginning of our marriage, when everything tasted like possibility. I had been called other pet names in my life, but in that kitchen, with the rain and the morning and the way Harold's eyes softened, the word felt like a marker, a boundary being drawn that had no place for me in its lines. I stood in the doorway long enough for the warmth of my bathrobe to cool. Harold looked up, saw me, and his face folded into a mixture of surprise and sheepishness, as if he had forgotten his place in a small domestic choreography. He smiled a little too brightly and said, "Morning, Ellie. Rain kept us talking." Melissa gave a small, professional laugh and wiped her hands on a towel, like she had been caught in an awkward shower. I could have turned and gone back to bed. I could have made tea and pretended the morning was the same as the day before. For a moment, I let myself hold to that small fiction. Maybe they had been talking about a recipe. Maybe I had misheard, and the word was some playful nickname that meant nothing. But as I moved to set a plate on the table, I saw my phone on the counter. I had left it there the night before. It lit up with a message as if on cue. The screen glowed with a short message preview. I picked it up casually, the way you pick up a paper on the porch, and then my hand froze. The message was from a number I didn't recognize, and the words were simple and ordinary and final. I'm ready. We'll talk tonight. I'll bring the bags. Something in me went very still. An animal that has felt thunder before. I read the message 3 times, like a person repeating a recipe they can't remember, trusting the sentences will become familiar if repeated often enough. The words didn't change. I'm ready. We'll talk tonight. I'll bring the bags. There was an economy in them that made the sentence feel like a decision already made. They weren't the words of a private joke. They were the words of someone making arrangements. I set the phone down slowly, aware of the way my hands trembled. Harold came to the table with a pot of coffee and poured for both of us. He sat opposite me and asked about the crossword, but his eyes kept flicking to Melissa, who had moved to the window to fold a dish towel with a practiced domestic ease. For a while I spoke as if the morning were ordinary, asking about a neighbor, about a phone call I had missed, about the weather. He answered, but his answers were brief. The silence between his words sounded like furniture being moved in another room. During the day, I kept glancing at the phone, as if the device might change the meaning of the message with time or heat. When I could, I tidied the bookshelves and rearranged a frame or two. Small, deliberate motions that let my hands be busy while my mind tried to figure how to ask what needed asking. There are conversations that do not allow themselves to be rushed into existence. You cannot schedule the moment someone tells you they are leaving, not the way they leave. You can only prepare yourself the way you might prepare for surgery. A kettle, soft socks, an acceptance that the anesthetic will be necessary. That night, when the house was dim and the rain had slowed to a hiss, Harold came into the living room carrying a cardboard box like the kind you use in moving. He was the picture of ordinary, a sweater draped over a shoulder, his face the map of middle age. But I recognized the way he held the box, the casualness of it, as if moving was not a thing that required a conversation, but rather the next chore on a list. He set the box down on the floor and turned to me. "There's something we need to talk about," he said. His voice was unadorned, as if he were reading from an instruction manual. He met my eyes. There was a fatigue on his face that made him look like someone too long at sea. The room collapsed inward for me, the way a theater curtain falls. Everything that had been whispered and hinted at that morning gathered into that single sentence like water into a basin. I felt neither the hot flare of anger that some people expect, nor the immediate wail of sorrow. There was a long, slow intake of breath, as if the thing to do was to measure the air and not to waste sound on panic. I asked after a moment, with a voice that I tried to keep even, "What is it?" The question was both literal and sprawling. It was the simple frame for the whole of my life. Harold sat down as if the furniture between us could hold him. He started with the logistical things first. He said that they had grown close, that Melissa had been a steady companion, that sometimes companionship shifts in ways people hadn't expected. He spoke of feelings like weather, something that had come on gradually, and now seemed to be part of the climate. He told me he didn't want to hurt me, that this had not been his intention. His words were precise in the way of someone trying not to break a glass. I watched his hands, the slow opening and closing as he tried to find grip on the script he had apparently rehearsed. When he told me they were planning for him to move out, I felt the world become peculiarly clean around the edges. It was as if I had been walking through a fog and suddenly a window had been opened. The plan was not the sound of a last-minute mistake. It was a structure, dates, arrangements, the names of places where things would go. Melissa would take over certain routines that Harold had been doing. Harold would find a small apartment not far from town. He said these things like a person reading out a checklist. The ordinary domesticity of it, the box, the lists, the names, made the whole thing feel like an administrative correction rather than an earthquake. I asked him why, and he told me he felt younger with Melissa, that the presence of someone lively was a relief, and that he had been feeling for some time that he needed this change. I remember watching his face and feeling a curious mix of things. Sorrow, because the man who had promised me a life together had found something else. A fierce, cold incredulity, because the words themselves were being chosen with the care of someone making a rational, unemotional decision, and a strange, pragmatic clarity, because there was no room for theatrics in that kitchen where he had packed a box. I wanted to ask where the love we had shared had gone, how it had been measured and found wanting. I wanted to say the kind of thing you cannot say in good faith, that he had broken all the promises, that he had been unkind in the moment when my body needed him most. I wanted to fling the box across the room and shout until my voice was gone, but the scene that unfolded instead was one of small, civilized movements. He moved a shirt into the box. He folded a towel and set it aside. He looked for the dictionary he had misplaced in our marriage, and put it in as if that was a symbol I should understand. There is a peculiar loneliness in watching someone leave the life you have built together without sudden calamity. No fight, no poison, only the gentle dismantling of the familiar. It is the kind of hurt that does not singe so much as freeze. I sat on the couch and watched him, and I felt the odd, steady motion of my mind cataloging things. The dates, the box, the message, the way Melissa's voice had lilted that morning when she'd said sweetheart. In that watching, there was a kind of work to do. Grief is not a single feeling. It is a small industry of tasks: notify, pack, explain, stand. I began to work in my head like a clerk, listing steps I would need to take, as if practical action could anchor me in the face of disorientation. When Harold looked at me finally, his expression was hard to read. He said, "I didn't want to surprise you, Ellie. I thought it was better to tell you in person." There was a gentleness in that, a consideration, and yet it did not undo anything. Better to tell you is a small mercy when compared to the thing itself. I nodded because words did not seem like the right currency at that moment. Later, when I lay in bed and the rain had softened to a distant hush, I thought about the way promises live in the air like dust motes, and how easy it can be for them to be brushed aside. I did not scream. I did not faint. I simply lay awake, with my back to the room, and felt the great gulf of time that was between the life we had planned and the life the rain had made. I thought of our wedding day in a church that smelled of lilies, of beaches and dances and the small domestic triumphs that have kept two people together. Fixing a leaking pipe, learning to listen, keeping each other's secrets, all of that was still inside me, a long catalog of shared afternoons. And yet, there on the couch, a man I had loved was arranging his leaving with an ordinariness that felt like an indictment of our ordinary life. The ceiling above me was pale and unadorned. I stared at it until the edges of the room softened, and the memory of the day when he had said, "We'll grow old together," replayed like a film. There was sorrow there, deep and slow, but underneath it, a small ember of something else. A quiet, stubborn sense that this would not be the end of my story. The night was long, and the rain kept time with the rhythm of my breathing. I listened to the soft sounds of the house as if they might provide an answer. They did not. What they gave me instead was a clear, aching silence in which a new chapter would have to begin, whether I wanted it to or not. The morning he left, the house didn't make a sound. No door slammed. No car engine groaned awake in the driveway. Just the stillness of a place that hadn't yet realized someone was gone. I woke to light slipping through the curtains, gray like the underside of a storm. And for a long moment, I didn't move. Maybe I already knew before my eyes opened. Some absences you can feel in the bones before the mind catches up. The note was on the kitchen table, folded neatly, like a bill, like something requiring no emotion at all. The first line was in his careful handwriting, the same penmanship I'd admired when we used to write Christmas cards together. "I need something new," it said. Please understand. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because I couldn't quite believe he'd use those words. Something new, like our 40 years had been a sweater he'd worn too long, and I was supposed to just nod and say I understood he needed a fresh one. There was no anger in the letter. No excuses, no apologies either, just a clean, quiet ending. And in its calmness, it hurt more. That's the cruel thing about a gentle goodbye. It leaves no scene to scream at, no shattered plates, no clear villain. Only silence, only the echo of what's missing. Melissa's departure came 2 days later. She didn't knock on my door to say goodbye. She didn't even send a message. Her final shift came and went, and that was that. Her perfume still lingered in the hallway, faint and floral, the kind that clings to fabric long after someone's gone. The coffee pot was still warm from her last use, and there were 2 cups on the counter, his and hers. Both washed, both turned upside down to dry. The kind of quiet coordination that told me they'd planned this together. It was such a small domestic detail, but that was what undid me. Not the letter, not even the empty closet, those 2 coffee cups, 2 lives that had shared everything, and one that had been erased overnight. That first week was a blur of unmoored time. Days didn't have names. Meals were an afterthought. The bed felt enormous, an ocean of cool sheets that made me ache. I kept thinking I heard him upstairs, or that he'd call my name from the porch, his voice half muffled by the wind, but the house didn't answer back. It just kept breathing, its own slow rhythm, like an animal sleeping beside me out of pity. My daughter Julie came by that weekend, her car tires crunching the gravel like punctuation to my silence. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. Her hug said everything. Sadness, protection, anger she was trying to hide on my behalf. She stood in the doorway and took in the emptiness. The jacket missing from the hook. The small gap in the bookshelf where Harold's favorite novels used to be. The faint indentation on the couch where 2 people had sat too close. "Mom," she said gently, "come stay with me for a while. Just until things settle." I smiled, though it felt brittle. "I think I need to settle here first." She frowned. "You shouldn't be alone right now." "I've been alone for a while," I said quietly. I just didn't realize it. She wanted to argue. I saw it in the set of her jaw. But she didn't. Instead, she left me with groceries, a casserole, and a promise to call every morning. When her car pulled away, the house went back to its hush, the kind that settles deep into your chest. That was when I realized this silence wasn't just emptiness. It was space. Space that I could decide what to do with. At first, I didn't know where to start. I had spent years caring for Harold, managing his appointments, keeping our lives stitched together while mine quietly unraveled at the edges. Now there was no one to cook for, no one to schedule around. The first night, I reheated Julie's casserole and ate standing at the counter, fork clinking against the dish, the refrigerator humming like an old friend trying to make conversation. I looked at the 2 placemats, one clean, one untouched, and laughed just once dryly. "Guess it's just you and me now," I said to the air. The sound of my own voice startled me. That night I didn't sleep much. My body felt restless, like it was searching for something it didn't remember how to hold. Around 3 a.m, I got up, pulled on my robe, and stood by the window. The moonlight was spilling over the porch, soft and forgiving. And for the first time in weeks, I thought about what I wanted. Not what I missed, not what I'd lost, but what I wanted, just for me. It had been so long since I'd asked myself that question that it almost sounded foreign. I didn't have an answer then, but I promised myself I'd find one. The next morning I did something small. I laced up my old sneakers, the ones Harold used to tease me about keeping for too long, and went for a walk. It wasn't far, just down to the mailbox and back. My knees protested, and the air was cool enough to sting, but each step felt like a small act of defiance. I could almost hear Harold's voice in my head saying, "You shouldn't overdo it," and that only made me keep going. A few steps more, then a few more after that. When I got back, I was breathing hard, but I felt something flicker inside me. Not joy exactly. but a kind of life I hadn't felt in months. The walks became a ritual. Every morning I'd stretch a little farther, to the corner, then down the road, then all the way to the small park by the water. I'd watch the ducks gather and the sun rise through the mist. I started bringing my notebook, the same one I used to jot down grocery lists, and began writing. Not long paragraphs, just small fragments. Things I noticed, feelings I couldn't quite name, words that helped me make sense of the ache. Some days it was simple. The roses are late this year. Other days it was sharper. How do you forgive someone who's not sorry? The pages began to fill slowly, like planting seeds in a garden I wasn't sure would ever bloom. Cooking came next. Not because I was hungry, but because I missed the smell of something warm in the house. I started with soup, chicken noodle, the kind Harold liked, and realized halfway through that I was making it for him out of habit. So I changed it. I added rosemary, lemon, a bit of cream, something new, something that was mine. The smell filled the kitchen, and for the first time, the air didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. I sat down to eat, alone but steady, and whispered to myself, "This is for me." Days turned into weeks, and the quiet began to change shape. It stopped echoing and started breathing. I moved furniture around, hung new curtains, and threw away the things that didn't belong to me anymore. Not out of spite, but out of mercy. Mercy for myself. I stopped listening for footsteps that weren't coming. I stopped checking my phone at night. I even stopped rereading that note. It was still tucked in the drawer, but it no longer held power over me. It was just paper now, just ink. There was one moment, though, that caught me off guard. I was sitting on the porch one evening, notebook in my lap, when I looked up and saw the empty rocking chair beside me, the one Harold used every night after dinner. For a second, my heart did that old aching twist, but then something steadied in me. I reached over, gave the chair a gentle push, and watched it rock forward and back. The motion was slow, easy, and I thought, maybe this is what healing looks like. Not replacing what's lost, but letting what remains move again. People talk about revenge like it's fire. They think it's about striking back, proving something. But what I was learning, one walk, one meal, one journal entry at a time, was that sometimes the quiet kind of revenge is just living. Choosing to exist fully when someone expected you to collapse, that was my rebellion. Not fury, not bitterness, just breath, just being. The days grew longer, lighter. I caught myself humming while I cooked, smiling at neighbors when they passed. When Julie came by again, she noticed. "You look different, Mom," she said. I shrugged, though I knew what she meant. "I guess I do," I said. She hugged me tight, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel fragile in her arms. I felt solid. I still missed him sometimes, the man I thought Harold was, not the one who left. But missing someone and needing them are two different things, and I had learned the difference now. My house wasn't haunted anymore. It was mine again, in all its creaking, imperfect, beautiful quiet. And though I didn't know what would come next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I did not expect a room full of folding chairs to feel like a harbor. But the first time I walked into the community center basement for the wellness group, that's what it felt like, a quiet harbor for ships that had been through a storm. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and there was the faint smell of brewed coffee and lemon cleaner, ordinary things that made the place feel safe. I sat down on the third chair from the front, because the second seat was warm, and I liked the idea that someone else had been there before me and gone on. It made me feel less like an intruder. At first I listened. People told small stories, about aches that had shifted, about grandchildren who couldn't pronounce their names, about recipes resurrected after illness. There was a woman named Marge who laughed in the middle of a sentence and made everyone else forgive the rest of it. There was a man, Tom, who tapped his cane to the beat of his own jokes. I realized quickly that the group's healing was less about answers and more about being seen. Someone would read a line from their week, and someone else would nod, and a small bridge would form between them. Some sessions focused on gentle movement, where a volunteer instructor guided us through stretches that reminded my joints they could move without shouting. Other sessions were about breathing and grounding, techniques that sounded new age when you read about them. But when practiced by a room of people who had each carried their own burdens, they felt like practical tools. We learned to name our feelings in simple terms: tired, scared, lonely, hopeful. Each small acknowledgement loosened something inside of me. I started bringing my journal. It had become a kind of confidant over the winter. Pages filled with small observations, recipes I was learning to adjust, lines of poetry I'd been too shy to say out loud. The first time I read one of my entries aloud, my voice trembled. It was a short piece about the way light falls across the porch in late afternoon. And when I finished, there was a soft silence, and then a clap from Marge that felt like sunlight. I had thought reading aloud would make me vulnerable in a way I could not bear, but instead it felt like handing over a small, honest thing, and having it returned to me polished by other people's attention. There was a slow alchemy happening. I began to laugh more. The laugh surprised me at first, small, breathy, then louder as if my ribs were making room for it. I realized I'd been reserving laughter for other people for years, like a rationed resource, sharing the little embarrassments of my day. Burnt toast, a grocery list where I mistakenly wrote pears instead of pears and pears and then bought 3 boxes of pears. Made me feel human in a way. Being stoic never had. Friendships took root like stubborn plants. Marge and I began meeting for tea after the group. She had been widowed 10 years before me and had an appetite for birdwatching and detective novels. Tom and I walked the park together on Tuesdays. He smoked cloves in secret and announced political opinions with the certainty of someone who had been a high school principal for 30 years. We found ourselves trading tips, recipes, gardening hacks, the best thornless rosebush for a small yard. It was ordinary, practical intimacy, the kind of closeness that does not require dramatic confessions. I liked that. I liked how it crept back into my life. A phone call from Marge to ask if I wanted to come to a local art show. Tom bringing over a jar of pickled beets he insisted I had to try. Day by day, the things that had felt heavy began to lighten. I began volunteering at the group, helping set up chairs, making sign-up lists. It made me feel useful in a way I had not felt since the days of lesson planning and parent-teacher conferences. There is a certain dignity that comes from being needed for small, steady things, folding napkins, pouring tea, checking coats at the door. Those tiny acts restitched my identity back together, not as someone defined by a husband's presence, but as a person with her own small competencies and kindnesses. One evening, months after Harold left, I received a card in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was his. My stomach tightened in that exact animal way it does before you meet someone who has a power you cannot refuse. I set the card on the counter and did not open it right away. I made tea. I washed a dish. I read a passage in my journal aloud to myself. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the card. Harold's note was short, the kind of thing that tries to be small to avoid scaring you. He wrote that he'd been thinking about me, that he hoped I was well, that he missed the quiet of the mornings we once shared. There was a line near the end that said simply, "If you'd ever like to meet, I'd appreciate the chance to speak." He signed it Harold. I told myself I didn't need to answer. I thought of every reason not to. I thought of the sting of how he had packed a box and left it on the porch as if moving were an errand, of the 2 coffee cups by the sink that had felt like evidence of conspiracy. Then I thought of the person I had been when he left, hollowed out, her hands trembling, and I wondered which version of me would agree to a meeting. The answer surprised me, not the woman who wanted to hurt him in return, nor the woman who longed for him to beg forgiveness, but the woman who had been learning to stand again. I wrote back. We agreed to meet at a small cafe by the river. It was a neutral place, with big windows and a low hum from people talking about the news and their grandchildren. I arrived early and chose a table that looked out at the water. When he walked in, he was smaller than the memory, somehow softened by time and choices. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read right away, contrition, regret, some mixture that was not dramatic enough to be cathartic. We spoke like people testing the floorboards of a house before deciding if they will stay. He apologized, not the long, theatrical apology that seeks absolution, but a quiet, patient one that acknowledged the hurt he'd caused. He said he'd been wrong to leave, that he had been selfish, that he had found himself in a way that had nothing to do with me, but had still caused me tremendous pain. I listened. I asked questions, not to punish him, but because I needed to know he had understood the depth of what he'd done. He did not offer excuses. He offered words that were honest in their failure. When it was my turn to speak, I surprised myself. I did not cry. I did not rage. I felt a cool certainty settle in my bones. "You didn't break me," I said, and the sound of my own voice felt like a little bell. "You just freed me from believing I couldn't live without you." The words were not triumphant so much as clear. They belonged to someone who had lived through winter and come out on the side of a different promise. The promise to herself. He sat quietly after that. There was a shadow of something in his face that might have been shame, or maybe just recognition. He reached for my hand across the table, a small, tentative gesture, and I let him hold it for a moment. It was enough. It was closure, but not the violent kind. It was a closing that sounded like a door gently shut, not slammed. We parted politely, and I walked home with my shoulders steadier than they had been in a long time. After that, my steps grew surer. I continued going to the wellness group, where now I helped lead a session on simple journaling. I read aloud from my pages sometimes, and people would lean forward to listen, as if I were offering them a small lantern for their own dark corridors. I started teaching a short class at the library on how to make a basic meal that feels fancy. Roasted vegetables, lemony chicken, good bread. The class was small but lively. Neighbors joked and shared tips, and I found pleasure in the way people's faces brightened when they realized they could cook something nourishing without fuss. There was still sadness. Some mornings, I would wake and feel the hollow ache of loss like a tooth that had not quite healed. But sadness no longer defined me. It was a color in a larger canvas. I began to plan small things. A trip to the coast with Marge, a garden bench I would build with Tom's help, a stack of books I wanted to read that had nothing to do with what Harold liked. There was a buoyancy to those plans, a sense that I was not just filling time but choosing it. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch with my notebook and write. Sometimes I rewrote the same sentence until it felt honest. Other days I wrote letters I never sent. To Harold, to my younger self, to the girl who loved to teach. Writing became a ritual of reclamation, a way to name the small things I wanted to keep. The taste of lemon in a properly made tea. The way the sun hits the porch rail in April. The exact timbre of Marge's laugh. The list grew long and tender. People who had known me before said I seemed younger, though I think what they really noticed was that I breathed differently. I took up space in a room in a way that did not apologize. I was kinder to myself, forgiving the stubborn old habits that sometimes tried to pull me back into caretaking at the cost of my own needs. My daughter noticed too. She called more often, but now our conversations had a different tone. Less worrying, more curious. She began to ask for my recipes and my advice on small domestic crises, and I gladly offered them. There are moments when I catch myself looking at the photograph of Harold and me on our wedding day and feeling only gratitude for the years we shared. We had love once, and that love had taught me tenderness. What I had not known then, what I had learned painfully and slowly, was that tenderness could be returned to oneself. That was the real renewal. Not a dramatic transformation, but a return to small, deliberate acts that built a life you wanted to live. And so I continued. I walked. I cooked. I read. I showed up at the group and sometimes led. I made a list of things to do when the house felt empty, and then, one by one, I did them. The house that had once echoed with absence now held a different sound. The clink of a spoon in a bowl. The turning of pages. Laughter spilling from the living room when Tom told a ridiculous story about the mayor. Life, it turned out, could be rebuilt not in grand gestures, but in patient stitches. By the time spring rolled in, it felt as if the whole world was taking a breath with me. The air grew softer, the mornings longer, and for the first time in a long while, I woke up not to silence that hurt, but to quiet that comforted. My house, once heavy with echoes, now carried the sound of living again. The kettle whistling, the faint hum of a radio, the scrape of a chair on the kitchen floor. Small sounds, gentle ones, the kind you only notice when peace starts to come back to you. My health followed the same rhythm. Slowly, patiently, my body remembered itself. The morning walks that used to end at the mailbox began to stretch farther. I could make it all the way to the park now, the one where the ducks gathered by the pond and children laughed over the sound of the wind. I'd sit there sometimes with my thermos of tea, letting the sunlight rest on my hands, and think about how different this warmth felt. It wasn't borrowed from anyone else, it was mine. Earned, not given. Julie came by one morning with a box of seedlings and a grin that looked so much like her father's used to. "Thought you might want to grow something new," she said. I remember the feel of the small green leaves between my fingers, the faint smell of damp soil. We spent that whole afternoon by the window, planting herbs in old clay pots, laughing about how I used to kill every plant I touched. "Maybe you just needed the right season," she teased. She was right. I had been living in winter too long. By May, I had started volunteering at the community reading center downtown. I'd seen the flyer on a bulletin board weeks before, but hadn't given it much thought. One afternoon, I found myself walking past the building and decided to go in. Inside, there were tables scattered with books, pencils, and the kind of half-drunk coffee cups that mean people are learning something. The coordinator, a kind woman named Denise, asked if I'd like to help tutor adults working toward their GEDs. "Just a few hours a week," she said. "You'd be perfect." I almost laughed at the word perfect. I hadn't felt that way in years. But I said yes. That first day I was nervous. I hadn't been in a classroom since I retired, and I wasn't sure if my voice still knew how to teach. But when I sat across from a young man named Caleb, a soft-spoken 23-year-old who struggled to read the simplest sentences, I felt something familiar awaken in me. Not pity, not superiority, just purpose. The good kind, the kind that makes you forget to look at the clock. I listened to him sound out each word, patient and deliberate. And when he finally read an entire paragraph without stopping, he looked up at me and smiled like he'd just discovered he could breathe underwater. That moment, I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it. The simple beauty of watching someone grow because you believed in them. It reminded me of myself, how I had been learning to read my own life again, word by word, breath by breath. Volunteering became a rhythm. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'd ride the bus into town, sit in that bright, cluttered classroom, and lose myself in the hum of pencils and quiet determination. The students came from all kinds of stories. Mothers rebuilding their lives, men who'd done time, teenagers trying to rewrite their beginnings. In their faces, I saw versions of myself, people learning how to start over. I wasn't just teaching them to read. They were teaching me what resilience looked like in a dozen different forms. After the sessions, I'd walk home through the square, stopping by the bakery for a small treat, something Harold would have said was unnecessary. But now, I allowed myself those small joys. A slice of lemon cake, a bouquet of wildflowers from the corner stall, a new pen for my journal. Each small indulgence felt like a promise to myself. I am allowed to have sweetness again. Some afternoons, when the house was warm with light, I'd put on my records, the old ones, the ones that used to play in the background of our life together. But now I played them just for me. The music filled the rooms differently this time. I danced once, slowly, my hands still stained from repotting plants. I think that was the moment I knew I had really come back to myself. There was no bitterness left in me, just gratitude for what had been and for what was still ahead. Then one morning, a letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar, but I recognized immediately that it wasn't his. It was from Melissa. She wrote briefly, politely, almost formally. She said she wanted me to know that Harold had been ill, that he was staying with his sister in Asheville and had asked her to reach out. She said he wasn't the same man anymore. The letter ended with, "He talks about you sometimes. He says you always saw the best in people." I sat with that letter for a long while, folded neatly on my lap. The words didn't hurt. They didn't stir anger or longing. They just landed softly, like a leaf that's drifted too far from the tree to matter where it falls. For years I thought healing would mean forgetting him, but it didn't. It meant remembering him differently. Not as the man who left, but as the man who once loved me, and then made me love myself by leaving. That night I wrote in my journal, "You can love someone and still outgrow them. You can lose someone and still be whole." It was the kind of truth that only comes after you've lived the ache of it. The next morning, I opened the curtains, and the light poured in like water. My plants had started to bloom, the basil stretching toward the sun, the roses opening with a quiet kind of pride. I stood there for a long time just watching. The house no longer felt empty. It felt full of things I had chosen. My books, my music, my laughter, my peace, all mine. When people ask me now if I'm lonely, I tell them the truth. Sometimes, I say, but not in the way I used to be. The loneliness I feel now isn't hollow. It's wide, open, and peaceful. It's the kind that leaves space for what's next. There's power in that kind of stillness. Every Thursday at the reading center, Denise asks me to close the session with something encouraging. One day I read from my own notes, words I hadn't meant to share but felt right to. I said softly, "Love can leave, but peace is something you can build yourself." The room went still. For a long moment no one said anything. Then someone clapped. Then another. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. And in that sound, I felt something settle deep inside me, something finished, something free. That evening I came home, made tea, and sat by the window. The sun was dipping low, painting the room in honey-colored light. I reached over to water the plants, their leaves stretching upward as if reaching for something unseen. My reflection in the glass caught me off guard for a second. Not because I looked older, though I did, but because I looked peaceful. There's a kind of beauty that only comes after breaking, a stillness that only arrives when you've stopped trying to get back what's gone and start tending what remains. As I sat there, listening to the quiet rhythm of the evening, I thought about everything I had lost, and everything I had found in return. My marriage had ended, but my life hadn't. My heart had been broken, but it had kept beating. I had been abandoned, but I had never stopped belonging to myself. When I finally turned off the lamp and looked out at the garden, the first fireflies had started to flicker near the fence line. I smiled, thinking how, for all their smallness, they still found ways to glow in the dark. Maybe that's what survival really is. Not strength, not revenge, not even forgiveness. Just finding a way to glow again. And so I do. If you've listened this far, thank you. If my story reminded you of something you've lived, or something you're still healing from, hold on to this truth. Peace is possible. No matter what you've lost, you can always build something new, right where you are. Don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, stay a while. There's more light ahead.